I'd like to introduce Robin Naughton. She is the Vice President of the Medical Heritage Library, and she is also Assistant Professor for Web and Digital Services at Queen's College, CUNY.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. For this session, we will have two speakers. Our first speaker is Helene Cazes. Professor Cazes is at the University of Victoria, Canada, since 2001, and Professor Cazes has published collections of essays and numerous papers on history of medicine, editorial, meditations, learned networks, and bibliography. She is the director of the open journal Topiques Études Saturninus and an associate editor of Renaissance and Reformation. Her current research project, Perfecta, the perfection of the female body, anatomical discourses and defenses of women 16th to 18th century, explores early modern connections between feminism or misogyny and anatomy. Her latest publication is the edition and annotation in collaboration with Frederic Charbon of Alphonse Leroy, Researches on Women's and Children's Clothing. And this was published in 2019. Today, she will be presenting on searching for female perfection in the MHL collections. I will also do the introduction for the second speaker, so that way both speakers can go one after the other without interruption. Our second speaker today will be Amber Hinde, a Ph.D. student in English language and linguistics at the University of Glasgow, Scotland. Her research interests center on language use in medical and health contexts, particularly the rhetoric nature of text in these areas. Amber's current research, funded by the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland, examines the rhetoric of two health gurus in late 19th and early 20th century Britain. Her previous research has included analysis of metaphors used by UK cancer charities and persuasion in early 20th century motherhood manuals. The title of her presentation is "A Doctor's Advice and Prescription is Now Worth More Than Any Soothing Syrup, Writing Scientific Motherhood in the Early 20th Century." Please welcome our presenters, and I will pass it over to our first presenter.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. Let me know if you don't. And thank you for welcoming me in this wonderful conference. I'm particularly pleased to talk after our keynote, because I think that technology is helping us to be more inclusive and to define the different way of telling what used to be called the history of medicine. So I switch now to my PowerPoint. And please let me know if there is a problem. What I want to talk to you about is searching for female perfection, or more precisely, searching for Perfecta, which is the name, the nickname we gave to a research project, which is helped and supported by the Canadian Council for Research. And I'll tell you a little about this research project, and also how working online before the confinement time changed the way I could interrogate our medical heritage and ask new questions. So the research project Perfecta, which for the time being exists for the public only as a website and a huge Zotero database, is trying to establish a connection between what is called in traditional history of medicine the discovery of the female body in the 16th century. So we have a narrative saying that, oh, suddenly anatomists could look at the female body and see things that nobody had seen before. And the concomitant emergence of discourses defending the women and affirming the equality of sexes. So my hypothesis was there is a shift, a paradigm shift in defining the female body around the 1500s. It's brought by a new movement called the sensible anatomy, which is looking at the body not through texts and tradition, but through direct observation. So using dissection and revisiting the Galenic tradition that had been in the authority for 20 centuries. And female sexual anatomy, so really the vagina, the uterus, the clitoris, became emblematic topics for this renewal of medical and cultural conceptions about sex. And it brought a lot of changes in the construction of genders, but also the understanding of procreation. So in the traditional narrative, the alleged first anatomical findings are due to Estienne in 1545, Colombo for the clitoris is 1559, and Falloppio in 1561, describing the so-called fallopian tubes. And we can say two things first. This so-called discovery is bringing a huge change in the way women are addressed in medical texts. So it was accepted that the female body was what they called an occasioned male. And in scholastic jargon, it means that it's a defective male. It's an imperfect man that lacks cooking. And I can go further with that if you're interested, but that's not my topic today. What I want to say is that this was accepted as a motto and as a truth and changed. At the end of the 16th century, the affirmation is that the female body is a perfect body, a different one, but a perfect one. And that's why we called it perfecta. So now, what did change for me, having the wonderful collections of the Medical Heritage Library to work on? It added these red arrows in the way I work. So basically, how do we work when we have such a hypothesis? We start with classical bibliographies and historiographies. So you look for the primary sources coming from there, and you make inventories, you transcribe, you translate, you use the dictionaries, you go back with new bibliographical questions, and there is this movement, dialectical movement between primary and secondary sources. But then, with the artificial intelligence search on MHL, well, we have surprises. First surprise is unknown sources, sources that nobody has commented, that show up and sometimes look very strange. Also, looking for the word perfect, new domains, for instance, alchemy. I would never have thought that perfection could be the achievement of an alchemic operation. Theology, but also a lot of very short abbreviated compendia for students, or I don't know, maybe even for women, compilations, reeditions that are not in our classic or usual lists of primary sources. And that brought for me new questions and also the possibility of new narratives. And what I'll talk to you about very briefly today is the questioning of the idea that traditions are defined by continuation, but also progress. So to give you an idea of what it was that I could establish by working with such a huge corpus, and a corpus that usually was not known to me, I'll have three steps. First, the recognition of what I call resistance to new knowledge. And I don't like the word resistance, but I couldn't find a better one. That means that once something is established in what we think is a scientific way, doesn't mean that it's disseminated and accepted. And we can see the persistency of old ideas, like the uterus has 7 little rooms. The good ones, that are the right ones, are for boys. The bad ones, that are sinister in Latin, are for women, girls, and the middle one is for intersex. So we find that up until the end of the 17th century. The second one will be listening to a conversation, which is the conversation of reception. And the last one will be about the polyphony. So I'll take an example. So the example of the hymen, which is supposed to be a membrane that would act as a seal of virginity. It would be somewhere in the vagina and would be pierced and with some bleeding at the first sexual intercourse. So if I look for the hymen, I find a lot of results. Oh, sorry. So just in the text contents, more than 15,000. So we can say also that it's a hot topic. If we search for uterus, we find many less. And what are the types of text that we find? Well, first, at the beginning of the 16th century, the idea that the hymen is a sure sign that a woman or a young girl has not been, as they say, corrupted. And that it's something that we usually can look at, that can be observed, and that can be used for perpetual dishonor or divorce. And we find also the mention of a test of urine or urination, which is absolutely everywhere and copied from a text to another one. So if a young girl is still a virgin, you can ask her to pee standing with her legs apart. And if she pees straight, well, she's been corrupted. So, but what we see is that very early, with Jacopo Berengario da Carpi in 1514, there is a doubt. And in 1521, Berengario says that, yes, here is the knowledge about the hymen, but himself could never observe it. And then we have we could think that, yes, they are going to, everyone is going to follow suit, but no, in 1530, Vernacular says that, and I'll cite that, he could easily observe the hymen, and he proposes an infallible test to know if a young girl is a virgin or not, which is to fumigate through the vagina and ask her to open the mouth. And if we see the smoke coming up the nose or the mouth, that means that she has been, quotation mark, corrupted. And that doesn't stop. So this elusive membrane is both described, and very late, up until 1612, and much later, actually, even far in the 20th century, and now in the 21st century. Sometimes it's even described with drawings and engravings. At the end of the 16th century, we have a whole treatise on this topic that is going to be re-impressed and reused in the 16th century. And we have a sense, when we look at that it's so strange that we keep having this conversation, and that we have to wait for the Vagina Bible again to tell us once more that there is no hymen, that it's not a body organ, and that all these descriptions are imaginations. This proved without any doubt by the end of the 16th century. But we still have the sense of a big mess. And that mess that we can document And that was the topic of a really boring treatise in Latin at the beginning of the 18th century. That mess is what interests me, that we cannot tell the history of medicine just as a line or like a set of steps, and we go progress by progress, cumulating the descriptions and putting them together. No, that's a huge conversation. And some people change their minds, some don't. So that's my second part, between hesitations and controversy, a continuous conversation. First, I want to say that beyond what we value when in the traditional history of medicine, which is the first edition, or the so-called discovery, history of medicine is documented by a crowd of reeditions, compilations, and revisions. There is, I'll give two examples. The first one is the multiple editions of Ambroise Paré works that change actually in their content for a century. The second one is the genre of the conciliator, which means conciliating the controversies. And that we can see it all over with many reeditions. And in these conciliations, there is no answer, no definite answer. There are only questions. And last, the very famous and popular collection of all texts on gynecology, published by Caspar Wolff and republished forever up until the end of the 18th century, which collects short texts on gynecology, or what will become the gynecology, but these texts are actually contradictory, and contradictions are not solved. And when you look at that, if you decide not to choose the text we've already used in the bibliography, but take the time to read and to listen to all this conversation, what you see is that there is no steady march, organ by organ, function by function, towards the mapping and understanding of the female body. And the so-called heroes that we have for the clitoris, the tubes, the ovaries are nearly invisible when they are buried under the mass of publications and discussions. And it shows two things to me. First, that gynecology is a composite of traditions. For a long time, I thought it was just a part of reproductive medicine that we find in veterinary medicine. But what we see is that in the 16th century, this question about perfection of the female body makes apparent that there needs to be a definition for this discipline, and that it will be done in the 19th century. The medicine of women cannot be, first, a medicine which is only in vernacular language, simple recipes, and little notations on the side, in the margins of general medicine, but also that it's composite. And this reversal from the tradition from the occasioned man to the perfect body is actually cultural history. And it's linked to other domains like the shame of showing the body, the pornography, the censure, but of course the gender and the representations. So it's a multidiscipline, and the interrogation by categories like perfection or perfecta helps looking at that. So my conclusion, I called it, I gave it a question mark. Is that an heretic polyphony? The first thing I want to emphasize here is that we have a real gap between the historiography of history of gynecology, which is presented as a linear accumulation of body parts is fragmentary and looks like a colonial expedition, giving names and descriptions with the name of the so-called discoverer. And the fecund approach of asking questions. So looking for perfecta yields many less results, but I'll try and summarize them. And you see here the image of the most frequent image in the 16th century after 1543 of the female sexual anatomy, where you recognize a uterus, a vagina, and a vulva. But you have to go back to the mindset. So what happens in this work in progress is that we can see that maybe not everyone reversed the so-called motto, the woman wears inside what the man wears outside. Not everyone understood difference in other ways than a defect or a deficit or a hierarchy, but everyone talked about it. And everyone questioned the idea that the body could bring a temperament, and also that what we call beauty could be a sign of health. So this perfection and the discourse about the perfection is actually a way of seeing a scientific, in the scientific field, a body which was otherwise, as I say, without head or tail. And this is the defense of the female body echoes the rising defense of equality between sexes and a reconsideration of the value of tradition. I would say also reconsideration of gender. But this is my last example. In 1578, a book of recipes and advice for the so-called women's disease, which was the traditional title for gynecology, has for chapter 1 the title that the woman is not a maimed animal, nor is she imperfect. And I think that it opens a new chapter for gender and for gynecology. So thank you. I would summarize this in 4 points. Thanks to MLH, I could expand the corpus considerably and discover Zotero, because otherwise I would have been drowned. I could also change the research tools for traditional collections, because of course, this is not a key word. And I could change the methodology of my research, questioning the categories and narratives and including other disciplines. I particularly value the brouhaha of these past voices and disputes that have fallen in the cracks of historiography and the chance to revisit my primary sources. So I want to thank you and thank everyone at the Medical Heritage Library. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think now we will hand it over to Amber. And we will all, please have your questions ready. At the end of Amber's presentation, we will ask questions for both presenters.
Hi everyone, I'll just check that you can hear me first of all.
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Okay. Well, hello and welcome to my presentation. I'm really happy that I can be here with you today all the way from Scotland. As you can see, I'm going to be talking about writing scientific motherhood in early 20th century Britain. But before I get into what scientific motherhood actually is and how I've been using the Medical Heritage Library to explore it, I'll just tell you a little bit about me. I'm a PhD student at the University of Glasgow in the Department of English Language and Linguistics. I'm in the second year of my PhD, which is kindly funded by the Carnegie Trust for the Universities of Scotland. My PhD explores the rhetoric of 2 health gurus from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I'm interested in preventive medicine and persuasion, and I'm looking at historical texts to try and tease that out. So my undergraduate and master's degrees were from the University of Glasgow, both in English language and linguistics. But I also spent a year studying abroad at the University of British Columbia, and that's where I really developed my interest in the rhetoric of health and medicine, particularly from a historical perspective. So today I'm going to be talking to you about my master's research, which was on the rhetoric of motherhood manuals. So I'm first going to talk a little bit about the historical context surrounding the motherhood manuals, because as Johnston says, it's important to first consider what a text is about, because what a text is about really has a bearing on what is said. So the early 20th century was a really turbulent period for motherhood in Britain. There was a significant growth in interest in infant welfare. Traditional knowledge exchange methods, such as inheriting advice from older female relatives, was increasingly being challenged by medical experts. And as the medical profession became more interested in infant and child health, the result was actually a devaluation of this traditional knowledge and experience that women had inherited on the subject. So we can see here that there's a tension between the public and private spheres when it comes to communication surrounding motherhood at this time. And this conflict of values poses a lot of interesting questions for linguists about motherhood advice literature. But so far, this genre has been fairly absent from linguistic scholarship. And some of the texts held by the Medical Heritage Library give the opportunity to really delve into this from a linguistic perspective. So you'll see on the screen here, at the 1906 National Conference on Infant Mortality, Burns stated, "First concentrate on the mother. What the mother is, the children are. The stream is no purer than its source. Let us glorify, dignify, and purify motherhood by every means in our power." So you can see here the importance that was being placed on motherhood at the turn of the century. Mothers were being blamed for high levels of infant mortality, and the notion of a good mother became an ideal that was going to be achieved through expert-led education. So these efforts stemmed partly from the British Army's poor performance in the Boer War, and the ideology of scientific motherhood is linked to the national priority of preventing infant mortality, and also to meeting demands of industry and the army. The government wanted healthy adults so that we could have a strong army, but they were turning their focus to infants and having healthy children in order to achieve this. And these concerns about physical efficiency were formalised in the 1904 report by the Interdepartmental Committee on Physical Deterioration. And this focused on the health of infants and young children, and particularly on the topic of infant feeding, and that's what my research really focused on. The motivation to publish motherhood manuals was also affected by the rising status of medicine at the time. So we have both the specialisation and the professionalisation of medicine going on, resulting in specialisms emerging such as paediatrics and obstetrics. So although motherhood manuals were not the only source of expert advice, they are actually a really useful source for better understanding how medical professionals actually communicated their expertise to mothers and what language they thought was appropriate to do so. And it's this very notion of how specialised knowledge was conveyed to mothers that I'm interested in teasing out more. So I'm looking specifically at the relationship between language and the ideology of scientific motherhood. And this is defined by Apple as the insistence that women require expert scientific and medical advice to raise their children healthfully. And she also notes that women were told not just that they needed to learn from scientific and medical expertise, but rather that they needed to follow the directions of experts. So from a linguistic rhetorical perspective, the medical writers weren't just writing to provide information, they were actually writing to try and persuade mothers to act. And this is really interesting from a rhetorical perspective. So because scientific motherhood has to do with positive and negative values, evaluation features are of particular interest in the motherhood manuals. So these features can be used to convey a positive or negative stance on what's being written about, and it can function really persuasively. So the specific evaluative features that I looked at in my research are on the screen here. I examined problem solution patterns, stance features, and engagement features. So problem solution patterns are kind of what it says on the tin. Writers will present problems and solutions in the text, but in certain different arrangements. Maybe they'll omit one aspect of the pattern for rhetorical effect, or place a lot of emphasis on one particular pattern. Stance features involve the writer using particular words and structures which convey their point of view on what is being written about. And engagement features are words and structures which are used to engage with the audience, drawing them into the text, and the writer is helping to guide them towards the desired conclusion. So all of these features on their own function persuasively, and they do in text that we encounter every single day. But looking at them together can give you a more holistic idea of the rhetoric at work. So for this study, I selected 10 motherhood manuals from the infant care category of the Wellcome Library's digital collections, which form part of the wider Medical Heritage Library. And these manuals had to meet certain selection criteria, such as they needed to be written by a doctor, and they needed to be published between 1902 and 1939. And I determined this date range based on the impact of the Boer War that I mentioned at the start, which ended in 1902. And then 1939 I chose as the end point because by this point you've got a broader range of maternal and child welfare services available. So I think this is really the key window where this kind of rhetoric was at work. So for this presentation, I'm just going to give you 3 example extracts so that I can illustrate some of these features at work in the texts held by the Medical Heritage Library. And I'll read through each example before commenting on it as well. I feel like that's the thing about text analysis presentations, is that you can't really avoid a big chunk of text on the screen. So I'll read through the examples for you before I comment on them. So here we have example 1, and it's from Grimshaw's Health Talks About Children. So I'll just read through it first. Supposing that all the methods described have been tried without success, and a thin, ill, fretful, wasted baby bears witness to our failure, what can medical skill do now? We can pre-digest the milk, that is, digest the curd by peptonizing powders, and thus relieve baby's stomach of work it would otherwise have to perform. Often vomiting and diarrhea will cease when this peptonized milk, diluted if necessary, is given, and the weight of baby rise satisfactorily even when all other methods have failed, especially if baby's stomach is medically treated as well as its food. This is a medical point I would have you not forget. So in this example, we have a problem being signalled by without success, thin, ill, fretful, wasted baby, and failure. And this is immediately followed by the question, what can medical skill do now? And with this statement, the author's suggesting that what's going to count as an appropriate response to the problem is going to be specifically a medical response. And the question is an engagement strategy as well, which aims to lead the reader towards the writer's viewpoint that the only valid solution to this is a medical solution. And the engagement is continued by the writer's use of the inclusive we, in that we can pre-digest the milk. And this works to include the reader as a participant in the discourse and persuade them to accept the medical solution that's offered. The words relieve and cease signal the solution component of the pattern in this example, and this characterizes the medical advice as a positive solution to the problem. So it's evaluated positively. And the author also explicitly states at the end of the extract, this is a medical point I would have you not forget, including both himself and the reader through the use of personal pronouns, which act as an engagement strategy. And in this case, it situates the author as the superior medical expert and the gatekeeper of knowledge, and the reader, the mother, as a subordinate in need of expert guidance. So we can see how scientific motherhood is playing out here in this example. So now we move to example 2, which is from Griffith's The Care of the Baby, and I'll just read through this example. So too much stress cannot be laid on the importance of regularity of nursing. No fault is more common and more pernicious than that of suckling a child every time it cries, and simply for the sake of quieting it. The temptation to do this is great, it is true, but the final results are evil, for the baby's digestion is almost sure to suffer, and its disposition to cry to become worse and worse. If the baby is asleep when the hour of nursing comes, it should be aroused and fed. It will in this way soon learn to wake at the proper time. So in this example, we've got the problem being signalled by the words fault and pernicious. And the author also uses the adjective common to describe the fault of mothers in this instance. And in the context of the time, this relates to the widespread belief that mothers were at fault. Charles Newman coined maternal ignorance theory, and this was very widespread amongst experts. So the problem is continued by the words evil, suffer, and worse. Evil acts as an attitude marker which conveys a rhetorical stance from the author, and it functions to emphasize the negative evaluation of the problem and try to persuade mothers of the severity of the problem. And it also aims to make them more susceptible to the solution that is offered. In this extract, the solution is characterized by the repetition of the directive should, and this gives the text a really instructional tone. And the use of the adjective proper at the end of the extract also taps into what Apple refers to as the exacting nature of scientific motherhood. So basically, things began to be measured more specifically and become more proper and exact when it came to motherhood in the eyes of experts. So this was a huge change, because before that, things would have been much more loosely measured, and mothers would have followed their own measurements for things, which may not have been so exact, and their schedules may have been different to what experts were advising. So here's my third example. It's from Starr's Hygiene of the Nursery, and he says, many untrained mothers make a failure of nursing because they know nothing of the manner of giving suck, of the length of time the child should be kept at the breast, of the proper time for and interval between feeding, and the importance of regularity. Upon these points, the physician should give minute instructions. So here the problem is signalled by untrained mothers' failure, and they know nothing. And you can really see the theory of maternal ignorance coming into play here again. And as with the previous example, the solution is signalled with the directive should. The final sentence of this example also further emphasises the exacting nature of scientific motherhood that I was referring to in the last example, because we've got the word proper, and we've also got, upon these points, the physician should give minute instructions. And it kind of gives the idea that no stone can go unturned, nothing should be left to the mother's own devices. And we can see here then that traditional knowledge is being subordinated very much to expert knowledge. So I'm now just going to summarise a couple of key findings from my larger study, which included more examples and more motherhood manuals. Firstly, I found that there was a large number of directives used across the texts, and we saw that in a couple of the examples, with the most common being the word should. And these directives almost exclusively appeared in the solution component of the problem solution pattern. And this strong link between directives and solutions relates to the instructional tone of the genre, and also the communicative purpose of wanting to get mothers to take action on this expert advice. So yeah, there was also a need to inspire action rather than just merely inform. So this made directives really important. They work to construct the ideology of scientific motherhood by instructing the audience on how to mother properly. And as rhetorical strategies, they work as a manipulation technique, building a relationship with the reader, which constitutes the writer as having the ultimate authority and the reader as the subordinate. So the prominence of solutions in itself is really intriguing rhetorically. The problem solution pattern, as I mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't always need to have all of the components. There could be more emphasis on one or the other. For example, in Belmonte's research on problem solution patterning in the press, she actually found that they often omitted solutions to kind of make the reader catastrophize on what was being said. But that's really not what I found with my research on motherhood manuals. In fact, solutions are at the forefront because it's advice literature, and that's what the doctors are wanting the mothers to focus on. So overall, this research has found that authors of early 20th century motherhood manuals use language really strategically in order to emulate the ideology of scientific motherhood. And it worked to positively evaluate the medical advice whilst degrading the traditional knowledge. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. And I also want to say a huge thank you to the Medical Heritage Library for making this possible online and for me being able to join you all the way from Glasgow. And I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Amber. So if there are any questions for either speakers, please feel free to put it into the chat and we'll go through and ask some questions. So one of our first question is for Amber. And this comes from Helene. Does this prescriptive advice to mothers accompany a change in the conception of natural motherly instinct? And these are in quotes. I find that the tone of your examples departs from the moralistic, frequent advice to mothers to breastfeed themselves, a widely addressed topic in the 16th to the 18th century. In any case, no discontinuation in the control of the female body. So,
yeah, I think I do still see in the manuals that I looked at an emphasis. It's almost as if it's kind of a paradox where you've got mothers being encouraged to breastfeed above all else and not use formula. And I think in one of my examples, it actually said that a mother was unworthy of the holy office of being a mother if she did not breastfeed her child. So in one way, they're being told, you must breastfeed, you must do this natural feeding, but they're being offered it in a really prescriptive way. Oh, but you have to do it like this. And I do find that interesting, where it's a natural method being encouraged, but it's very exacting and you must follow our instructions to do this. So I guess there is that kind of paradox between the natural instinct and the expert advice.
Thank you. Helen, did you want to say something?
Oh, yeah, well, first I wanted to thank you, Amber, for this wonderful presentation.
You're welcome.
But also, I believe that this is something stable in the medical literature about motherhood, that mothers are a medium, but they are defined by their ignorance.
Yeah.
So that's really striking how even when a book is addressed to young mothers, and we have many of them, the person of the mother is obliterated as ignorant and incapable of expertise, even midwives. So that's really interesting, and thank you for this, for pointing that. The other thing I want to say is that there are many blogs for new mothers right now, and many of them keep being prescriptive like that. So that's to be a new mother is to be under the fire of advice.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to do like a similar analysis of modern motherhood texts. I think there would probably be some striking similarities despite the historical gap. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Our next question comes from Melissa, and this is for Helen. I was intrigued at the verse where perfecta appeared in different traditions, theology, alchemy. How do these sources outside of medicine weave into your research on female perfection?
Okay, thank you for the question. The different domains actually showed me that perfection is a technical term, and it means, for instance, in alchemy or even in theology, it means a form that reached its final stage, its final development. So the perfection of the human body is the male adult body. So a child, for instance, is defined by imperfection. And for us, we kept a moralistic or an aesthetic meaning, but we have forgotten that it was a category to discriminate between stages in the development in what we call now the becoming of individuals. And I was quite surprised to find that. The other thing is it really helped me to see that when perfection is associated with the word woman, usually it's plural. So that's the perfections of a female body. That's, oh, she has perfect breast, or she has a wonderful face, or the color of her skin, the skin tone is perfect. And that it could be fragmented. Whereas for the male body, it's never fragmented. It's a question of proportion, good health, and embodiment of what a human being can be. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Shimul, and I hope I didn't say that incorrectly. The question is, why don't you speak about the situation when a lot of states really do not train mothers to nurse and to care for their children because of capitalist policy and social differences. So maybe your thoughts on that idea, the impact of policy and social differences in terms of training mothers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I noticed, I think there was another question as well about like class almost. So, I mean, I only focused on the UK in my study, but obviously at the beginning of the 20th century, there's a lot of class differences. You are getting accessibility to texts a little bit more at the beginning of the 20th century, but I think what happened was advice would kind of filter down. So maybe middle-class women would read the texts and circulate amongst themselves. And I think a lot of more working class women received the information by word of mouth. I think working class women were really villainized at this time because they were viewed as not being able to achieve this perfect state of motherhood because of poor living conditions. Maybe they weren't able to breastfeed. And I think you've got a lot of like subject positioning in the text, which I didn't analyze specifically, but I did notice where, for instance, they might assume that a woman has like a nurse to hand or a nanny. So that's obviously assuming that they are of a particular class. So I'm not sure if the question is referring to the US or not, but I'm not so sure about the difference between different states. But certainly in the UK, there was a difference between like different classes and how they were communicating.
Another question for you, Amber, is were there any female doctors in your search? And this comes from Shannon.
Mm-hmm. There was one female doctor, Sophia Jex Blake. One manual by a woman that I looked at. That's not to say that there weren't more, but in my data set there was one. I noticed that she was more hesitant to commit to statements. She wasn't as dogmatic as the male writers, so maybe she would use more kind of like from the perspective of modality. She wouldn't say you should do this. She would say you could do this. And I did notice that about her language and the way that she engaged with her readers. But it would be interesting to gather a data set of only women doctors from the time and female writers. There was a lot of books written with no identified author. It would say by a housewife or by a mother. So then it becomes hard to know the background of that author. But Sophia Jex Blake is one who did identify herself by name.
The next question is for Helen, and this is from Michael North. How did discussions differ in the Latin versus vernacular texts?
That's a very good question. I would say that the difference between Latin and vernacular changes in the 16th, 17th century, and is not the same also in various places. So for gynecology, that's for a long time in the Middle Ages, there were little compilations of mainly of recipes, often in three parts, that were supposedly addressed to women, and very early were translated into vernacular. So one of them was The Secrets of Women. The other one was called the Trotula, and that's so I don't want to enter too much in details, but it was quite different from the Latin learned medicine, and with no theory, and usually a lot of all the generalities in the prefaces to these three parts, saying that the female body is imperfect and that's why women are sick. And they are more sensitive. They would be more sensitive to pain than males. And they don't change a lot. And they are not discussed as such, which is quite interesting. They are passed down, and with an incredible continuity, at least up to the end of the 18th century. What we see in the 16th century is that general medicine is turning to vernacular, and that the first topic addressed in these controversies or the list of errors given by Joubert is the female body. And that's very interesting, because it seems that vernacular is the place, at least in France, for discussion. And at the same time, I compared that to English publications that are much less controversial, short, cheap books that were addressed to women, but actually to their husbands and to the barbers, with just recipes. So I would say that what I found is that the medical descriptions that were in the Latin texts take at least 20 to 30 years to reach a vernacular public. And also that the discussion is much less respectful of authority in the new discussions in vernacular than in the compilations in Latin. But that's a huge question. I hope I answered what was asked.
Thank you. Our next question is for Amber, and this is from Tegan. My understanding is that the equivalent manuals published in the US at the time were very much aimed at the white, middle, and upper classes to the exclusion of others. Is this true of the manuals published in the UK as well? And if so, could you tell us about how that affects the engagement-oriented language?
Yeah, so I think it's this same thing about like subject positioning, and you can gather more about who a text is addressed to from the language used. So they will, I'm struggling to think of an example now, but they'll assume things about their audience and put that into their texts, so you then know more about that audience, or you know who is welcomed into that audience. I think definitely it was addressed to middle and upper class white women as well in the UK. But it's kind of a paradox again, where they were wanting to target the working classes, but they were kind of going about it in the wrong way. They were addressing middle class women, and they would often villainize working class women in the texts. One thing I know is that a lot of the advice given in these manuals, so a really famous one was by Truby King, called Feeding and Care of Baby, and his advice on motherhood kind of just passed by word of mouth between women. I can't remember the exact paper, but someone did a study where they did oral histories with women who remembered their mothers and grandmothers talking about Truby King's advice and passing it between each other. So I think that's how it realistically passed between women, maybe filtering into working classes. But yeah, middle classes were definitely who the manuals were directly, one, accessible for, and two, written for, with the language used. So yeah, I hope that answers your question okay.
There's one more question for you, Amber. This question is from Keith, and it's how do trained nurses fit into your research? With visiting nurses working to actively bring doctors' advice to women and mothers during this time period, it would seem their books and advice may offer an interesting point of view.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I would agree that looking at the writings of nurses would be really interesting. So I purposefully excluded them for this study, looking at the doctor's language. But I did notice that there were a lot written by nurses. So you'll get like a book on motherhood, and the author will say by a trained nurse. So I think they did play a really key role. I do know that there was often kind of competing authority between nurses and doctors at this time when it came to motherhood. For example, with the hospitalization of childbirth, as you're going into that period, nurses and midwives are kind of given a lesser role, and like pregnancy and childbirth become more hospitalized. So I think there was an interesting tension between nurses and doctors at this time, and it would be interesting to see how the nurse's advice maybe differs from the doctor's advice, what different language is used. So I haven't investigated that much myself, but I do think that would be an interesting thing to look at. So thank you for that.
And this, we're coming down to time. So one last question. This one is from Kim. And this question is for Helen. I love how you are challenging the idea of medical discourse as a colonial expedition into the female body. I wonder if you could speak a bit more about how working with a digital corpus permitted you to challenge that narrative.
I'll be very brief. I think that the colonial so-called adventure is producing a narrative which is linear. And so you have a lineage. So Columbus went to Cuba. He was the first one. He was followed by another person later. And there is a narrative that links the landing to us, to the present. In this narrative, there is only one hero at a time. And this hero is naming and owning what he has named in the consequence, the later narratives. That's a little like that the female body, but also the human body, is presented in traditional tales of the medical progress. And with the naming, the owning, and a linear mono-heroic narrative. And what happens when you type, I don't know, Hymen or clitoris and clee and claytoris in MHL, is that you find many people who were at the same time not saying the same thing, not listening to each other, or sometimes listening to people who had been disproved 10 years before. And that's a very different take on history of medicine. If Mary Haig is here, and thank you, Mary, for being there if you are, this is exactly what I found in the Oslo Library at McGill. So a narrative of the sources arranged chronologically And you could see the advancement of the light on the dark continent of the female body. And also, that's very interesting because we have in the choice of words things that I find in Latin, like Colombo and his clitoris. And I'm thinking, gosh, no, that's not his. So, and the idea that women were so ignorant of their own body that they needed a discourse coming from outside to make it an object, a scientific object. So they needed to be dead and dissected and described to have a language. And that's very close to the idea of the colonial idea that there were lands that were not exploited, that were left derelict with no inhabitants, no discourse, and suddenly were brought to existence by the colonists. I hope it answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our presenters. This will conclude this session, and I think our next session is lunch.